You're traveling through the fog, and just ahead is an island of mermaids, miracles, and monsters. Your next stop, Newfoundland, and these are its strange truths and tall tales. When nights grow long and familiar paths suddenly lead you astray, when fog shrouds the coast in deathly gloom and strange lights flicker in empty bogs, that's the time when ghosts and ghouls explore this newfound land. Welcome, foolish listener, to a Halloween bonus episode of the Strange Truths and Tall Tales podcast. I'm Robert, your host for a brief journey into a creepy chapter of Newfoundland's past. Tonight, I have a creepy true story from Elliston on the tip of the Bonavista Peninsula. It's a tale of an unwelcome visitor who showed up one frosty night some 200 years ago. I call it the Night of the Thunder Growl. It was cold. Despite the temperature, there was no sea ice anywhere around Bird Island Cove. From the rocky shore to the horizon, there was nothing but blue sky and open sea. It was beautiful, but more importantly, it was a good day for working. The woods around the cove echoed with the sound of axes. It was the perfect time to haul firewood. While the ocean was free of ice, the ponds near the community were frozen solid, which meant horse-drawn sleds and dog teams could make a short path to the best timber. A horse crossing a frozen pond could deliver a sled of firewood in a fraction of the time taken by one sticking to the woods trails. Not far from town, Peter Chalk was sitting by a small campfire. He was enjoying a cup of tea. There's nothing quite like a cup of tea brewed in the woods, he thought. It was even better if it came after a successful day's work. Peter looked with pride at Lady, his mare. She was harnessed to a sled full of timber. It certainly wasn't all the wood he'd need, but he was well under way to keeping his family warm next winter. In any case, there was nothing more he could do in the woods today. The sled was full, and the sun was getting low in the sky. It was time to tow the wood home, his least favorite part of the chore. Even though the ponds were frozen and the trip was much shorter, it was still liable to be a challenge. He had to cross frozen bogs, and keeping the sled clear of fallen trees, frozen stumps, and deep gullies required constant vigilance. The darker it got, the more difficult the journey would get. More than once he'd gotten stuck, and he didn't want it to happen again. It was too much work. Peter reached down to the campfire and lifted his kettle. The stick, holding it above the coals, fell into the fire. It was a bad omen. This is going to be a wonderful trip home, he thought. He kicked snow over the remains of the campfire, and with a quiet hiss, the last embers faded away. The woods seemed oddly still. They had all afternoon, come to think of it. He hadn't seen a single crow or gray jay in hours. That was strange, Peter thought. He couldn't remember having tea in the woods without at least one jay brazenly trying to join the meal. He didn't give it much thought until he heard it. From somewhere just beyond the tree line came a sound. It was a deep, low growl. Peter froze. He'd never heard anything like it. Whatever it was, it sounded sinister. No wonder the birds had been keeping their distance, he thought. There was some terrible predator, a huge animal by the sound of it, lurking in the trees. He couldn't imagine what kind of animal made the sound. It was nothing like a wolf or bear. Again came the growl. The hair stood up on the back of his neck. Whatever it was sounded very close. He didn't dare move. Peter gazed into the trees. In the fading light, it was difficult to see anything. In every shadow he expected to spot the glint of an eye or maybe catch a glimpse of movement. But there was nothing. His heart was racing. Then another growl, this time from behind him. He'd never been afraid of the woods, but now they seemed dark and dangerous. It was as if everything was holding its breath, as if the whole forest was caught in the gaze of a hungry predator, a predator that seemed to be circling closer. Everything in Peter's being told him he had to get out of the woods. He dropped the kettle, and as fast as he could, he released Lady from the sled. This was no time to worry about firewood. He had to go. He had to leave this place. He grabbed his hatchet, and they were off. Through the woods they raced, man and horse. No matter how far they traveled or how fast they moved, they kept hearing the growl. Sometimes it seemed to come from the left, other times from the right. Whatever this creature was, it was fast, and it was chasing them, through the trees, across the ponds. It was always there. He knew if he was going to survive, he had to make it back to town. There would be help there. Then, suddenly, he burst free of the trees. He was almost home. If he could just make it across the mesh, he'd be there. Faster and faster he urged Lady onward, until the familiar little cove began to unfold around them. Still, the sickening growl kept its pace, but always just out of sight. Was he losing his mind? How could this thing have run circles around him and still stayed out of sight? It made no sense. Ahead of him on the path, Peter could just make out the silhouette of a man. It was his cousin David. Peter watched as he burst into the shed, only to return seconds later holding a bird gun. He put it to his shoulder, pointed to the left, then swung to the right. As Peter drew closer, David brought his aim to rest on Lady. Suddenly recognizing Peter, he lowered the gun. "Where is it?" he hissed, his eyes darting back and forth. "Where's the beast?" "I didn't see it," Peter panted. "It followed me from the woods, but I couldn't see it." David shook his head. "Must be more than one, then. It's been here this last hour." "What is it?" Peter asked. I've never heard the like." "I don't know, but there's not a single soul in the cove who hasn't said a prayer since it started," David began. "Mother swore there was a bear up under the house. She thought it was trying to make a den there. She had Father go after it. But when he looked, there was nothing. James Porter figured it was a polar bear down by the shore. He took his gun, said he was going to shoot it," David panted. "He followed the sound and nothing, no bear, just nothing. He came right to the edge of the cliff, said the whole place seemed to roar at him, said he'd never seen the like of it. It's bad, Peter." David swallowed hard. "They're saying it might be the end of the world." As if on cue, another thunderous growl ripped through the dusk. The two men parted, each for their homes. Peter found his wife and 2 children waiting in the kitchen. They greeted him as though they'd never expected to see him alive again. He set down the hatchet, for the first time since leaving the woods, and hugged them warmly. Together they huddled in the kitchen, while just outside the door, just beyond the walls, and right under the floorboards, the thunder growl roared. Peter kept the hatchet on the table in front of him. With every thunderous blast, the oil lamp flickered, painting shadows across the wall. It looked as if the strange being were closing in on them, as if it were trying to extinguish the light, until finally dawn came. The roars continued, unabated, as much a mystery in the morning light as they had been in the darkness. There were no strange footprints, and no signs of an animal at all. Then, at noon, as suddenly as it started, the thunder growls stopped. The strange sound was never heard in Bird Island Cove again. The source remains a mystery to this day. Most of what's known about the thunder growl comes from an account by Reverend Philip Toke, who recorded it in his 1846 book, Wandering Thoughts. He didn't witness the events, but he was told about it during his time in Bonavista and Elliston. His informants told him it occurred about 15 years prior, which I guess means it happened sometime in the 1830s, but no one knows for sure. Toke wrote, "About 15 years ago in the winter season, a very singular and most extraordinary sound was heard in the neighborhood of Bonavista. It commenced about 3 o'clock in the afternoon and lasted until the next day about noon. The men at Bird Island Cove were going about nearly all night, some with loaded guns, some with hatchets, and others with whatever weapon they could command. The sound is described as resembling distant thunder. It has also been compared to the growl of a bear or the bellowing of a cow, conveying a deep, sepulchral tone. What is most strange and unaccountable is that it appeared alongside of everybody, although at the time some were at a distance from each other of from 1 to 5 miles. Men hauling wood at the time thought the sound came out of the ground immediately under the slide or team, and, in some instances, were so alarmed as to leave the wood behind. Several females thought a bear had got into their chambers and ran terrified from their dwelling. Nobody knows what caused the thunder growl. The grinding of offshore ice has been discounted because apparently there was no ice at the time. Prevailing thoughts include unusual atmospheric disturbances or something geologic. Toke writes that 2 days after the growl, the community experienced one of the heaviest seas ever known. Was it related? Maybe. Regardless of explanation, the night of the thunder growl left a mark on the people of the area. In the book More Than 50%, Hilda Chalk Murray describes an explosive growth in Methodism in the Elliston area in the 1820s. She suggests that the fear of the growl helped to fuel that. Obviously, she places the growl as having happened pre-1830. People were terrified, Chalk Murray writes. It's not unlikely that many sought comfort in the evangelism of the early Methodists. I certainly don't know, but who's to say what comforts you seek when the night starts to growl? Well, that's it for this Halloween special. Stay tuned for more creepy seasonal content before the end of October. And Season 3 of Strange Truths and Tall Tales is coming soon, with more cool stories and some pretty exciting special guests. In the meantime, check out the blog productofnewfoundland.ca for more creepy stories, some spooky videos, and lots of Halloween music from local artists.